Now it'll be a lot easier to see the effects of those two settings if we have something near this block that we can use to measure it with. So I'm going to set up another block tag above and below our paragraph. I could use just about any block tag we want to, a heading, another paragraph, but what I'm going to use is the generic block tag div. Normally we use div tags to group other elements together, but here I can just use it as a plain old block. I'll add one above the paragraph, and just so we can style it and see it better, I'm going to set up a class that equals the word red. Now I'm going to make this an empty tag, so I'm going to put the close tag right after it. And I want one of these blocks above and below my paragraph, so let me just copy that and we'll paste it down below the paragraph as well, just above the closed body tag. Now of course we need to make that red class, so let's go up to our style tag at the top. And first I'll add a selector for the red class. Classes always start with dot, so that's dot red. We'll add our braces. And then we can add our style rules. Now divs are block tags, so they have borders, backgrounds, colors, widths, heights, all the same properties. So what I'll do for starters is I'll set the width the same as our paragraph. And of course that's 300 pixels. And I'll also set the height. And we'll just use 50 pixels for that. Last but not least, the style says red, so I'll set up a background color of red. And I'll just use the named color instead of typing the hexadecimal equivalent. Let's save our change, and let's go see what our page looks like. Now we can see nice red blocks above and below the paragraph. Now notice if I didn't set a width and height, I could set a red background on an empty div, and I probably wouldn't see it on the page because it's not taking up any space. This way we can use those blocks to measure our paragraph and see how it changes. Already we can see one very important piece of information, and that is there are already some spaces between our blocks and our paragraph. We can see some on the top and the bottom, and we can also see a little space over here on the left-hand side as well. And this tells us one very important fact about margins and padding inside of HTML. Most of our block tags actually have default margins and padding set up on them. Now that's fine, except when you start exploring this as a developer, you'll notice that there's no real agreement from one browser to another what those settings should be. So your page layout could change depending on what browser you're sitting inside of. Of course, an easy way to remedy this is to clear out those defaults, and that's what a lot of developers do. So let's go back to our code, and the first thing I want to do inside of my paragraph style is I'd like to set up zeroed margins. I'll use the margin property, which sets all of my edges at once, and I'll simply just set it to 0. Notice when we specify 0, we don't have to specify any units whatsoever, because 0 is essentially 0. Now let's save that change, and we'll go back and look at our page. By removing the default margins on the paragraph, you can see that the space is closed up, and now my red blocks are directly on top of and below the paragraph, touching the border. The left-hand side still has a gap though, so that must be coming from another tag. Now our H1 tag up here at the top also does have some default settings for margin and padding, but our div tags are one of the only block tags that have none. So let's go back to our document, and what I'll do for starters is I'll just get rid of the H1 tag so it's not going to be causing us any kind of problems. Let's save that change and refresh our page. And you can see that we have a gap at the top and the left-hand side. And that's coming from the actual body of the page itself. I'll go back over to our document, and right at the top of our style tag, I'll add a body selector. And what we're going to do here is we're going to zero out both margins and padding. I'll use margin and set the value to 0. That'll set all my margins to 0. And I'll go ahead and put in padding as well. Now it seems like overkill at the beginning, but remember, my browsers don't agree on what this setting should be, so I might have a different browser giving a default margin at the edge of the body, and another browser setting up a default padding. By setting them both to 0, I'm basically getting rid of those right at the very beginning. I'll save my change, we'll go back to our page, and now you can see that my content starts right up in the top left-hand corner with no gaps or spaces at all. A lot of developers automatically include a body margin 0 and padding 0 right at the top of their CSS, just to clear out any kind of spacings before they get started. Now we can also see something else. I set the width of both of these elements to be 300, but you can see my paragraph is sticking out just a little bit here. This happens because when we set the width on a block element inside of HTML and CSS, we're setting the width of the content itself. And if you add margins, padding, or even borders, those all take up space. Remember, we set a border of 2 pixels, and that actually adds 2 pixels to the size of our element on both the left hand, right hand, and top and bottom. What we're seeing here is the addition of all those different elements. The width of 300 plus the 4 pixels for the border elements. Now, we can really see that if we go back and change the border to something really thick, like let's say 10 pixels. I'll save that change. We'll go back and refresh our page, and you can see that my paragraph is pushed out even more. Now, that does mean that in order to control these widths properly, you have to make sure you account for not just the widths of the content, but also any borders, margins, or paddings that you've added. Now, let's try out paddings and margins. First of all, I'll just add a padding to this paragraph. We'll go down and put in a padding setting, and I'm going to make it, let's say 5 pixels. What padding does is it creates space or gaps inside of the content border. Let's take a look at our page. And you can see that now we have a little 5 pixel gap on all sides. There you can see it along the bottom, on the left edge, and along the top. And you can see that now our paragraph has pushed out even further from the edge because we have to account for the border on the left and right and the padding on the left and right. Now let's take a look at margins. I'll go back and set the margin property here to another 5 pixels. We'll save our document and refresh the page. And now you can see a little white gap appears that's 5 pixels on the left, top, and bottom. And we can't really see it, but of course there's another white margin on the other side. What we can see from this is that margins add space on the outside of the border, and padding will add space on the inside of the border. And of course, don't forget that the border itself takes up space. If we go back in and remove the border, I'll delete the entire rule, save our change, and refresh the page. And there you can see the 5 pixels for the inside padding, the 5 pixels for the outside padding, and of course, since we don't have any border, that's not going to be pushing out anything at all. If we were to try to add up the total width of the paragraph block that we're looking at, we'd start with the 300 pixel width, plus 5 pixels for each side of padding, which would be 10, and 5 more pixels for each side of the margin, which would be another 10. So the entire width of our paragraph would be 320 pixels.